This battle didn't just decide a war, it erased an entire power from history, and you've probably never heard of it. The year was 53 BC. Rome was at the height of its power, its legions stretched from Gaul to the sands of Syria, and the Senate spoke of new horizons to conquer. Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in the Republic, thirsted for one final triumph. He had wealth beyond measure, political power, and a place among the first triumvirate with Caesar and Pompey, but not the military glory that Rome revered above all. That glory he sought in the east, against the Parthian Empire. As he departed from Syria with 7 legions, banners snapping in the desert wind, the soldiers whispered among themselves. "He thinks he is Caesar," one centurion muttered. "He wants to match Pompey's triumphs," another replied. Yet in their eyes lingered doubt. They knew the Parthians were no ordinary enemy. The Parthian Empire, heirs to the mighty Persians, ruled the endless plains with horse and bow. They were nomads turned kings, masters of a weapon Rome could not match, the horse archer. Swift as shadows, they could rain arrows and vanish before a sword was raised. At their head stood Surina, a noble of Parthia, brilliant, cunning, and proud, commanding an army smaller than Crassus's, but forged for the desert. In the bustling city of Carrhae, where ancient Mesopotamian stones bore silent witness, fate was preparing its stage. The sun burned harshly, the air thick with dust, and the legions marched eastward into a land that seemed endless. Crassus ignored omens, warnings from his officers, and even the cries of his own son, Publius, who urged caution. His mind was filled only with visions of Roman eagles raised over Parthian palaces, his name etched beside Caesar and Alexander. But far out in the plains, beyond the horizon, Surina's riders were already watching. Silent silhouettes on the dunes, their bows gleaming in the sun. They would not meet Rome head-on. No, Surina planned something far more deadly. The trap was set. The Roman legions left the safety of the Euphrates behind, their formations cutting across the barren Mesopotamian plain. To the men of Italy, the land felt like a curse. The sun blazed without mercy, the air shimmered with heat, and the earth cracked beneath their sandals. Water was scarce, shade rarer still. Their armor, once gleaming with discipline, now weighed like chains upon their shoulders. "Where is the enemy?" one legionary groaned, spitting dust from his mouth. "They hide like jackals," another sneered, though his voice betrayed unease. Crassus, riding ahead with his lictors, ignored their murmurs. His ambition was a fire that burned hotter than the desert itself. To him, every step eastward was a step toward immortal fame. He waved away the council of Artavasts, the Armenian king allied to Rome, who had advised leading the legions through the hills where cavalry could not swarm them. "The plains are faster," Crassus declared, "and victory favors speed." But in truth, Surina had already calculated every move. The Parthian general's army was small, perhaps only 10,000 horsemen, but each man was a master of the bow. They carried composite bows that could pierce armor at distances Rome's pila could never reach. And they had something more deadly still, camel trains laden with thousands of spare arrows. Surina's warriors would never run out of death to hurl. On the 7th day of the march, the Romans spotted movement on the horizon. Black dots in the shimmering heat, swelling into a line of riders. The soldiers cheered, believing at last the Parthians had come to stand and fight. But when the cavalry drew nearer, the cheer turned uneasy. They heard no drums, no war cries, only the eerie silence of hooves on sand. Publius Crassus, young and eager, rode to his father's side. "Father, their numbers are fewer than ours. Let us strike now, crush them before they scatter." Crassus's eyes lit with greed. "Yes, my son. Today we will break them like reeds." But as the legions shifted into battle order, Surina's trap began to spring. The Parthians did not charge. Instead, they spread wide, circling, their bows rising as one. A sharp whistle pierced the silence, and the sky darkened with arrows. The desert became a storm of iron. The first volley fell like a curse from the heavens. Thousands of arrows hissed through the air, striking shields, helmets, and flesh. The Roman line staggered, men screaming as shafts pierced their armor. The familiar clash of steel on steel was absent, there was only the endless thrum of bowstrings and the agonized cries of the wounded. Testudo, centurions roared, and the legions locked their shields overhead. The great tortoise of Rome formed, iron and wood bracing against the storm. For a moment it worked, the rain of arrows clattered harmlessly on the curved wall of shields. But then the Parthians adapted. Their horses wheeled, surrounding the formation, loosing arrows from every side. Arrows slid between shields, struck at angles, found the gaps. The tortoise became a cage. Inside, the men choked on dust and fear. "Gods, they don't stop," one soldier gasped, clutching a bleeding arm. Another cursed, trying to wrench a shaft from his thigh. The Roman pila, heavy throwing spears, the pride of the legions, were useless. The Parthians were too far, always out of reach. And when a century tried to break formation and charge, the horsemen simply galloped back, loosing arrows even as they retreated. It was the dreaded Parthian shot, a maneuver where riders twisted in the saddle to fire backward with perfect aim. Rome had never faced such war. Crassus rode along the lines, shouting, "Hold firm. They cannot fight us hand to hand. Endure, and they will break." But even his words felt hollow. He had promised his men plunder and glory, yet all they found was blood and the endless hiss of arrows. Then came the drums. Heavy, deep, rolling like thunder across the plain. From behind Surina's riders emerged another wave, cataphracts, Parthian knights clad in steel, their lances glittering in the sun. They did not charge, not yet. They only advanced slowly, their presence a looming terror. The message was clear, the storm of arrows would never end, and if the Romans broke, the knights would finish the slaughter. Publius, the son, turned to his father, fury in his young eyes. "Father, we must strike. Give me the cavalry, and I will smash their archers." Crassus hesitated, the weight of command crushing him. But desperation forced his hand. "Go, my son. Show them the might of Rome." Publius raised his sword, and with 1,000 Gallic cavalry allies at his side, thundered across the sands toward the circling horsemen. The battlefield held its breath. The desert thundered beneath hooves as Publius Crassus led his cavalry forward. Dust rose like smoke, the Gallic horsemen roaring with wild abandon, their long swords flashing in the sun. At last, thought the Romans, the battle would turn. At last, the Parthians would be crushed beneath a proper charge. The Parthians scattered before them, their horse archers wheeling away in perfect coordination. For a moment, it seemed they were fleeing. Publius's men cheered, spurring faster. "Run, you cowards," shouted a Gaul, his hair flowing in the wind. "Forward!" Publius roared. "They cannot stand against Roman steel." But it was no flight, it was the next turn of Surina's trap. The Parthians lured the cavalry farther from the legions, deeper into the open plain. The Gallic horses grew weary, sweat foaming at their flanks, yet still they pursued. Then the Parthians wheeled around, bows raised once more. The storm began again. Arrows slammed into the charging cavalry. Horses screamed, rearing as shafts sank into their flesh. Riders tumbled to the ground, crushed beneath hooves. Still, Publius pressed on, desperate to close the distance. A few Parthians fell to Gallic swords, but the majority danced away, loosing arrows even as they fled. It was as if the enemy had endless breath, endless strength. At last, Publius glimpsed salvation, Surina's cataphracts, the armored knights, standing still like statues in the heat. "There," he cried, voice hoarse. "If we break them, the battle is ours." The Gallic cavalry hurled themselves forward, meeting the wall of steel. The clash was titanic. Lances pierced through men and horse alike, shattering bones, hurling bodies into the dust. Gallic swords rang against Parthian armor, sparks flying. For a moment, it was brutal hand-to-hand combat, blood, screams, the madness of battle. But the Parthians were relentless. Every time a Gallic blade found a gap, a dozen arrows answered. Every time a knight fell, the archers rained death upon the exhausted Romans. Publius fought like a lion, his sword arm red with blood. He cut down 1, 2, 3 of the armored riders, rallying his men again and again. But then his horse collapsed beneath him, pierced by arrows. He staggered to his feet, surrounded by Parthians, his remaining allies cut to pieces. A Gaul rushed to his side. "We are lost, Lord. There is no escape." Publius's voice was steady, though his face was pale. "Then let us die as Romans." The Parthian lances closed in. Back at the Roman lines, hours later, a riderless horse stumbled into camp, its saddle soaked with blood. The legionaries knew then, Publius would not return. Word spread through the Roman camp like wildfire: Publius Crassus was gone. The soldiers, already weary from the endless arrows, now felt despair gnaw at their hearts. Some cursed the gods, others cursed their commander. Many fell silent, eyes fixed on the horizon, half expecting to see their comrade's severed head raised by the enemy. They did not have to wait long. As the sun bled into the desert sky, the Parthians rode close enough for the Romans to see. At their head was Surina, tall and regal, his armor gleaming. With a cruel flourish, his men raised a pike upon which Publius's head was fixed. His once bright eyes were dark, his hair matted with blood, his young face frozen in death. The Parthians mocked the Romans, shouting insults, drumming their shields, laughing. The legionaries trembled with rage. Some tried to break formation and charge, only to be forced back by their officers. Others wept openly, striking their shields in grief. Crassus himself, when he saw the head of his son, nearly collapsed. His lips moved, but no words came. He clutched at his horse's reins as if they were the only thing keeping him upright. Surina's voice carried across the plain. Though the exact words were lost to time, the mocking tone was unmistakable. He taunted the Romans, daring them to abandon their shield walls, to meet Parthian steel and die faster. Then, with a wave of his hand, the arrows began again. The Romans endured another night beneath the unending storm. They had no water, no rest. Wounded men groaned in the dust, their bodies pierced by arrows that could not be removed without tearing flesh apart. The desert air reeked of blood and sweat, and vultures already circled overhead. At dawn, the legions rose again, their shields heavy, their strength fading. Crassus tried to rally them, his voice hoarse. "Romans, stand firm. Think of your fathers, your children, your wives. If we die here, we die with honor." But honor did little to stop the Parthian bows. Once more, the horsemen swarmed, circling, loosing volleys from every direction. The testudo groaned under the hail of iron. Men fell without ever striking a blow. The mighty army of Rome, 7 legions strong, had become prey. And Surina, the hunter, was far from finished. By the second day, the desert plain was littered with corpses. The Romans stood in tight ranks, but their shields were heavy with arrows, their spirits drained. Hunger gnawed at their bellies, thirst cracked their lips. The once mighty legions, trained to conquer Gaul and crush Spartacus, now huddled like cattle awaiting slaughter. Surina pressed his advantage with cold precision. His archers maintained constant pressure, circling endlessly, never allowing rest. When the Romans tried to advance, the Parthians simply retreated, loosing arrows as they fled. When the Romans tried to stand firm, the knights advanced, threatening to charge until fear forced the legions back into defensive formations. The centurions shouted themselves hoarse. "Hold the line! Raise shields!" But their men no longer moved with the crisp discipline of Rome. Fear had sunk into their bones. Every whistle of an arrow made them flinch, every shadow in the dust made them tremble. Crassus, consumed by grief and rage, seemed unable to act. His officers pressed him for decisions. "General, we must retreat to Carrhae, to the walls. Strike at night, give the men a chance to rest." But Crassus waved them off, muttering incoherent orders, his eyes always drifting toward the place where his son had fallen. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, the Parthians unleashed their most terrifying tactic yet. A coordinated feint, a thunderous advance of cataphracts, shook the earth. Lances lowered, armor gleaming, they seemed ready to smash the Romans to dust. The legions braced for impact, only for the Parthians to wheel away at the last moment, laughing as arrows filled the sky again. The psychological toll was devastating. Men began breaking formation, running toward Carrhae in panic. Officers cut them down to restore order, but every hour more slipped away, deserting in fear. That night, the Romans gathered in silence. Fires were forbidden, lest they draw the Parthian eye. In the darkness, soldiers whispered prayers, or cursed Crassus for leading them to ruin. Some clutched amulets from home, others pressed their foreheads against the earth, awaiting death. Crassus convened his surviving officers. His voice trembled. "We cannot hold the plain. Tomorrow, we march to Carrhae. There, at least, we will have walls to shield us." But the desert was vast, and Surinna knew every path. The retreat would not be salvation, it would be another snare. When the moon rose over the desert, the Romans began their retreat. Silence was their shield, no horns, no banners, no shouted orders. Only the crunch of sandals in the sand and the groans of the wounded carried through the night. They marched like shadows, hoping to reach the safety of Carrhae's walls before the Parthians noticed. The legions moved in broken columns, burdened by their dead and dying. Some soldiers staggered under the weight of comrades they refused to abandon. Others, too weak to continue, collapsed in the sand and begged their brothers to leave them. The desert swallowed their pleas. Crassus rode among them, his face hollow, his body hunched as though the years had doubled upon him in a single day. He muttered to himself, clutching the reins. Once the richest man in Rome, now he seemed a beggar before the gods. His officers whispered behind his back. Some blamed his greed, others his cowardice. None dared speak it aloud. The march was long, and fear gnawed at every step. Each gust of wind felt like hooves, each shifting shadow like Parthian scouts. Men jumped at nothing, clutching their swords. At one point, a rumor spread that the Parthians were upon them, and panic rippled through the columns. It took an hour to restore order. But the Parthians were watching. Surinna had spies shadowing the Romans, tracking every move. At dawn, when the weary legions were still far from Carrhae, horns blared across the plain. The hunters had returned. Parthian horsemen swept in, arrows raining down once more. The Romans groaned as they raised their shields, too exhausted to form perfect ranks. Men stumbled and fell, trampled by their comrades. The wounded from the day before, dragged along in desperation, screamed as arrows found them again. The retreat became a slaughter. At last, what remained of the legion stumbled into Carrhae, collapsing within its ancient walls. The city was no salvation, it was a trap of stone. There was little food, little water, and no reinforcements. The citizens looked upon the battered army with horror, knowing the storm that followed them would soon engulf Carrhae as well. Crassus stared at the walls, sweat streaking his dust-caked face. He whispered, almost to himself. "We are not trapped here with them, we have trapped ourselves." Outside, Surinna's horsemen encircled the city, torches flickering in the dark. The siege of Carrhae had begun. Within Carrhae's walls, despair thickened like smoke. The city had no provisions for such a vast army, water ran short, bread was scarce, and the wounded filled every street with their moans. The Roman discipline, once their pride, had withered into bitterness. Some soldiers cursed the gods, others cursed their commander. More than one whispered of desertion. Crassus, weighed down by grief for Publius and the crushing burden of command, seemed a ghost of himself. He rarely spoke, his eyes hollow, his hands trembling. His tribunes pleaded for orders, but he gave none. It was left to the centurions to hold the men together, their voices hoarse as they barked discipline into the night. Outside, the Parthians taunted them. By day, the horse archers rode close to the walls, loosing arrows in lazy arcs, laughing as the exhausted Romans ducked behind their shields. By night, they lit fires across the plain, their silhouettes dancing like spirits. And always, they mocked with their trophies, Roman standards captured from shattered cohorts, and the severed heads of fallen officers displayed on pikes. Then came Surinna himself, resplendent in silvered armor, his black hair flowing, his presence regal. He sent envoys to the gates, their words dripping with contempt. "Romans," they called, "why do you cling to your walls like frightened children? Your general has led you into ruin. Surrender, and Surinna may show mercy. Resist, and you will all die like your sons and brothers on the plain." Some soldiers cried out in anger, begging Crassus to let them fight. Others muttered that surrender was their only hope. The divisions deepened, threatening to tear the army apart. At last, under the crushing weight of hunger and fear, Crassus agreed to parley. Surinna invited him to a meeting outside the walls, promising safe conduct. The officers begged him not to go. "It is a trick," one tribune warned. "Do you think the Parthians know honor?" another spat. But Crassus, broken by grief and desperate for an end, consented. As he left the gates, accompanied by a handful of officers, the legions watched in silence. Some prayed. Others cursed his name. On the plain beyond Carrhae, Surinna awaited. The hunter had one final snare to spring. The sun beat down on the plain as Crassus rode out to meet Surinna. His armor was dulled by dust, his eyes ringed with sleeplessness. Around him, his officers whispered nervously, hands resting on the hilts of their swords. They had marched to win a kingdom, and now they marched toward humiliation. Surinna awaited with the full majesty of Parthian splendor. His armor gleamed like molten silver, his cloak shimmered in the light, and behind him stood his nobles, tall, proud, their horses adorned in gold and silk. To the weary Romans, it was like stepping into the court of some ancient god. The two commanders faced one another in the silence of the desert. Surinna spoke first, his voice calm, almost mocking. "Marcus Crassus, richest man of Rome. You came to take our lands, and instead you have given us your son, your legions, and your honor. Why persist in this charade? Lay down your arms. Spare what remains of your army." Crassus clenched his jaw, his lips trembling. "I came to wage war, not to beg mercy." Surinna smiled thinly. "Then let us end this war as men of rank should. Let us clasp hands, as equals, to seal peace." The Parthians extended a litter for Crassus to step down from his horse. His officers murmured uneasily. "General, beware," one whispered. But Crassus, hollowed by grief and failure, obeyed. As he approached, the Parthian soldiers closed in. Hands reached out, not in friendship, but in force. They seized Crassus's arms, dragging him forward. His officers cried out, swords flashing, but they were surrounded. Chaos erupted as the Parthians struck. Some Romans were cut down on the spot, others fled back toward Carrhae, shouting that the general had been betrayed. Crassus struggled, but he was no longer the powerful man of Rome, he was an old man, exhausted, broken. Surinna looked down upon him, cold and victorious. Accounts differ on what followed. Some say Crassus was struck down in the struggle, his body trampled in the sand. Others claim Surinna ordered molten gold to be poured into his mouth, a bitter jest that the richest man in Rome would finally feast on the wealth he so adored. What is certain is this: Crassus never returned to his men. When news reached the legions in Carrhae, despair crushed them. Their general was dead, their leaders slain or captured. Thousands tried to flee in the night, scattering into the desert. Most were hunted down by Parthian riders, their bodies left to rot in the sands. Only a pitiful fraction ever reached the safety of Roman Syria. Rome had suffered one of its greatest humiliations. And in the east, the Parthian banners waved proudly over the fields of Carrhae. The disaster at Carrhae echoed far beyond the desert plains. News spread like wildfire through the Roman world, an entire army shattered, 7 legions gone, 30,000 men slain or captured. For the first time in living memory, the invincible power of Rome had been humbled by a foreign enemy. In Rome itself, the Senate was stunned into silence. Crassus, once the wealthiest man in the Republic, had perished in shame. His death unraveled the fragile balance of the first triumvirate. Without him, Caesar and Pompey turned upon one another, plunging Rome into civil war. Thus, the sands of Carrhae became the spark that set the Republic aflame. For the Parthians, the victory was immortalized in legend. Surina returned in triumph, parading captured Roman standards through the cities of the east. Thousands of Roman prisoners were resettled far from their homeland, some said as far as Margiana near the borders of China. Their fate was never fully known, whether they lived as mercenaries, slaves, or vanished into the dust of forgotten history. The humiliation stung Rome for decades. The captured legionary eagles became a symbol of lost honor, and generations of Romans dreamed of revenge. It was not until Augustus, years later, that some of those standards were returned, not through battle, but diplomacy. Yet the wound of Carrhae never fully healed. And what of Surina, the architect of Rome's downfall? Irony followed close upon his victory. His triumph at Carrhae made him too powerful, too beloved, in the eyes of the Parthian king Oroda. Fearing his general's rising fame, Oroda had Surina executed within the year. The hero of Carrhae died not by Roman steel, but by the jealousy of his own king. Thus ended the tale of Carrhae, a tale of arrogance and cunning, of ambition and betrayal. Crassus sought glory, and found only ruin. Rome, master of the world, discovered that even its legions could be broken. And in the silent desert, where vultures circled over the bones of fallen men, the wind still carried the echo of bowstrings, the sound of Parthian victory.